Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's University-Based Child and Family Policy Consortium webinar. My name is Hannah Klein. I'm the Communications Associate at the Society for Research in Child Development, and I'm also the Consortium Assistant. The topic of our call today is becoming a better policy researcher. Before I turn things over to our call moderator, who is Philipsen Hetzner, I wanted to say a few words about the consortium and about using GoToWebinar. The University-Based Child and Family Policy Consortium is a network of more than 35 university-based institutions, including centers, schools, departments, and programs that all have an interest in child and family policy. We are organized around three main purposes. The first is to share the latest findings and strategies for conducting policy-relevant research and to facilitate collaboration across our member institutions. The second is to encourage cross-disciplinary undergraduate and graduate training to support the next generation of child and family policy researchers. And the third is to foster effective translation between research practice and policy audiences. The consortium is run in collaboration with the Society for Research in Child Development and hosts a number of webinars each year on a variety of topics. If you are interested in learning more about the consortium, having your institution join the consortium, or if you would like to join our listserv, please see the information on the following slide. Another few words about today's event. We are using GoToWebinar to host the call. All of the attendees are muted. And attendees, please use the chat box on your screen if you would like to send in a question for our speakers. Bio sketches for today's speakers have been included as a handout and can be downloaded from the webinar platform itself. And today's webinar is being recorded. After the call ends, I will be uploading it to SRCD's YouTube channel, and we'll share that link with you all in a follow-up email. If you have colleagues or friends who are not able to make today's webinar but are interested in the content, please feel free to share the link with them. And now I'm really happy to turn things over to Nina Philipsen Hetzner so that she can introduce our speakers. Nina, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Hannah. As Hannah said, my name is Nina Philipsen Hetzner, and I work at the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation at the Administration for Children and Families, which is within Health and Human Services. I would have been joined today by my co-moderator, Tracy Carter Clopêt, but unfortunately she's under the weather, and so she's with us, but she's unable to moderate. Tracy is currently an SRCD Policy Fellow at the Office of Child Care, which is also within ACF. And she and I both welcome any questions or any follow-up you might have after the webinar concludes. So Tracy and I have been working together with our SRCD colleagues to organize this webinar on becoming a better policy researcher. And we both feel really passionate about this topic because as developmental psychologists, in our current positions at ACF, we are pretty much as face-to-face as you can possibly be with the challenges of linking research and policy and practice together. And we assume that others out there in the world must be facing similar challenges. So Tracy and I, and probably everybody on the phone, understands that good policy research is more than just writing a few sentences about policy implications into our discussion section. But what is it that we can specifically do, and how do we get started? And while some of us have gone straight into positions in the government or in policy research firms, what about those of us who are interested in conducting policy-relevant research while pursuing an academic career? And regardless of setting, how do we conduct our work so that we can link the policy and the practice world to our work in a meaningful way? So we thought that there would be no better people to answer these kinds of questions for us than Dr. Chazan Cohen from the University of Massachusetts at Boston and Dr. Elizabeth Gershoff from the University of Texas at Austin. Both are currently in academic positions at universities, but both have a variety of experiences behind them and have built thriving careers bringing research to the policy and practice world and vice versa. So they're going to tell us a little bit today about their relationships with various government representatives and entities at different levels of the government, how they formulate and address policy research questions in their work, and also then how they translate their work for policy and practice audiences. So as Hannah pointed out, all of the registrants have access to our speakers' bio sketches, And so we invite you to take a look at those so that we can forego extensive introductions and get right into our discussion. So we're just going to get right started. Hi, Rachel, and hi, Liz. Thank you both for being with us today and joining our discussion. Let's get started at the very beginning and hear a little bit about how each of you first came to do policy research work. So Rachel, let's start with you, and then we'll move on to Liz.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both Nina and Tracy for inviting me to today's webinar. And thank you to everybody for dialing in and participating quietly in the discussion. So we were asked to share a little bit of our experience about how we came to this work and try to highlight some things that we found helpful to us along the way. And particularly, we were asked to think about graduate students and what might be helpful from their perspective. So I will try to make some general points, but I have to add a caveat that my experience really is deeply rooted in early childhood research. So in terms of my experience, I was incredibly fortunate to work in the government for 11 years. It was a very long time. I did not expect to stay in the government for as long as I did, but it was just a wonderful job. And I was in the office that Nina is in now. And then I went back into academia. And my time in government was absolutely critical to the work that I'm doing now. But I think that people take a lot of different routes into doing this work, and each of us are very individual and different. But I would say there are two general kinds of themes or concepts that might be helpful to keep in mind. And I would say they're probably not just true for just kind of career paths into policy research, for probably any career path, but maybe they'll be helpful to you. Anyway, one is to think about taking advantage of opportunities that come along. Serendipity plays such a big role in our life choices and life opportunities. And for me, it was sometimes taking advantage of an opportunity, even if it wasn't central to my path that I thought I was on. And another one really is about relationships and connections. And I think relationships are key to forging any career path, but this particular research world, I think, is extremely collaborative, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in the webinar. But really seeking out people with similar interests and establishing these connections has been very important in my career. So to give you a little bit of background on my story, I started in undergraduate school in a very experimental developmental psychology lab looking at infant perception. And that, while I found it to be intellectually fascinating, it was clear to me that I was really destined to do more applied developmental work. But I didn't come to program evaluation and policy work until much, much later. I did a terminal master's at Tufts University. I really chose that in order to get more applied experience, and it was a wonderful, truly multidisciplinary program, and I was exposed to policy research, but it didn't grab me at that point. And then I went on to study developmental and clinical psychology at Yale, where I was further exposed to policy work. There was something called the Bush Center, which is now the Ziegler Center, where we had weekly brown bag speakers come who did applied and policy work. And they also, this was an amazing experience, we had a trip to DC every year where we get the chance to meet with government and advocacy and research entities. And it was an incredible experience, but I still didn't see that as my path. I was planning to design interventions for depressed mothers with young children. But then I was basically looking for a job in New Haven, and my spouse was finishing his dissertation work, and I ended up getting a job in the pediatrics department working on an evaluation of a home visiting program for teen moms. And that was a transformative experience for me, and from then on I was just hooked on evaluation work and the kinds of questions that were asked and answered. And I saw the ACF job posting at SRCD at the biennial conference, and that was it for me. I think, as Nina mentioned in her intro, there are many, many settings from which to do policy-oriented research. There's government, academia, research firms, foundations, and many, many other types of settings. And some people, you may be hearing from some people that there isn't really flexibility in terms of moving from setting to setting, and you have to make decisions and kind of craft your work for one type of setting. And that's certainly what I was told when I was in graduate school, but I don't believe that. I believe that there is a lot of flexibility. It's not always easy, and there are the things you need to do viable for, things you need to do in order to be viable might have to do with the types of research questions you study and how you disseminate your findings. For instance, peer review really is valued for academic jobs, but it is possible to have fluidity. And one last point I would just make is that for me, it was incredibly important to think about career choices with taking family life and my own life course development into account, as probably was clear from my talking about making decisions to live in a city to be with my spouse. So for me, that was very important to be thoughtful about what settings were preferable to me and available to me during different phases of my life. So I think I'll leave it there.
Rachel, this is Liz. Before I go, I wonder if you want to tell people what it means to do research in government. So I think not everyone understands what it actually means to be working in the government doing research, not in academia. Do you want to just say a couple sentences about that before I start?
Sure, I can say a couple sentences about that, but what I would say is it's as varied as almost anything else. There are a lot of different places to do research in the government, and I should put a plug in for what I think is one of the most wonderful experiences you can possibly have, which is the SRCD Social Policy Fellowship, which provides the opportunity to really see up close, at least for a short period of time, what that might look like. And I'm sure all of you, as you're involved in the consortium, you know about this fellowship, but it places people throughout the government in congressional and executive offices. And what we always tell people when they come in for their interviews is your experience will be completely different depending on where you work in government. So the office that I worked in, that Nina works in, is we have a whole schema of the government. I'm wondering, should we jump to that now, Nina? Do you think that would be helpful?
I'm sorry, I might have pushed us ahead. Sorry about that.
That's okay. I mean, I'm happy to talk about that now.
Well, maybe we should wait to talk about that when we talk about the government stuff.
Okay. Well, what I will just, let me briefly say that I think that working in the office, and we will tell you exactly where in the government it is located, but in the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation is a branch of the government that is very committed to services. So the research there was very programmatic and program policy oriented. So its focus is on Head Start, child care, child welfare, those kinds of programs, which is very different than if you do research at NIH, let's say in NIMH, or in one of the other branches of NIH, where you may be working more on grants work and other kinds of projects. But at the office that I worked in, we were very closely connected to programs. And so most of my research was on early Head Start, and I will tell you much more about that in a little bit. But I think it's a good point that Liz is asking to bring up, that even within the government, doing government research is not one thing, it's many, many different things.
So I guess I can go next. This is Liz Gershoff, and I'm at the University of Texas at Austin right now. And so I'll tell you a little bit about my circuitous history. One of the things that Rachel and I realized when we were talking about our histories earlier was that we have circuitous roots and there's a lot of serendipity involved. So I'll tell you a little bit about how I tried to capitalize on serendipity in my life. So I was a psychology major in undergrad. and did do some research on various projects. And on one of those projects, I was listening to interviews of parents talking about disciplinary events. And that's actually where I got my interest in physical punishment, which is one of the things that I'm most known for these days. But it was because of listening to these tapes and some parents saying they use physical punishment as a last resort, and some people saying they did it right away. And I just started thinking about why people did it at all, and why people did it sometimes as a first resort, sometimes as a last resort. And that kind of got me thinking about discipline and the role of children in children's lives. And I kept that interest, but that wasn't what I applied to graduate school to go study. I actually thought I wanted to study language development. And so I came to the University of Texas thinking I was going to do something with parenting and something with language development, and thinking I might actually even minor in linguistics. And I took a class in linguistics, and I volunteered in a linguistics lab. And then I just realized my passion wasn't really there, and decided I wanted to do more parenting research. And so in doing the parenting research, I started, my interest in physical punishment came back again. And so I started pursuing that with faculty here. I went to graduate school here at UT Austin also. And so I started studying that, not thinking about policy really, but just studying it as an issue that affects a lot of children. And then I got this idea to do a meta-analysis because I thought, well, you know, there seems to be a lot of research, but nobody really knows what it says altogether. And so I kind of did that as a side project as a graduate student. And then that paper has actually, you know, it wasn't intended to be a policy relevant paper, but it actually over the years has influenced policy. It's been used in various countries that have passed bans on physical punishment have cited my research as one of the reasons why it's a good idea to pass a ban on physical punishment. So that's very gratifying to find that policymakers and advocates are still using this research that I did years ago. At the time, it was really driven by a scientific question. What do we know about the effects of spanking on kids? And it turned into something that became very policy relevant. And then later on in graduate school, I started to realize that I was really interested in policy and actually tried to get a joint degree, a joint PhD and Masters of Public Policy here at UT Austin, but they wouldn't let me do that. So I decided to try to pursue policy how I could and try to get training how I could. And so in part, I had a mentor, Aletha Houston, who was faculty at the time in my department, and she continues to be a mentor to this day. And she, as many of you know, has really been pushing our field to think a lot about how the research we do can be and should be translated into policy. And so taking class with her and getting to know her really spurred me to think about policy. And then I applied to an internship with Jeannie Brooks-Gunn at Columbia. She still has a research center, and she had a grant from the W.T. Grant Foundation to sponsor graduate students over the summer in New York to do internships at an agency somewhere in the city, and to kind of meet every week to talk about policy and policy-relevant research. And I interned at a place called Homes for the Homeless, excuse me, which still exists and hosts several large family shelters for women and children in New York City. And they were interested in how many of these women had violence exposure in their histories. And so my job was to design a survey all of the moms, analyze the data, write a report, all in 2 months. And I was able to do that somehow, amazingly. And I didn't do all the interviews, luckily, because we had over 400 interviews. And I was really excited. I did this report. I ran some regressions. I had this great report. Excuse me. And in the end, they were like, well, we don't really care about the regressions. We just want the bar charts. And I was like, oh, okay. So this was my first introduction to how research is used in various avenues. And so it's not that they didn't care about the research and they didn't value research, but for them, they needed something distilled down to very easy to digest information. And so that was very eye-opening to me. They didn't care about all the things I'd been learning in graduate school. They wanted to know the data, but they wanted to know it in a very simplistic form. And then later on, I approached them and said, well, can I publish this data now? And they said no. And I was kind of surprised. I thought, well, why wouldn't we want to get this data out there? Because we found that most of the women had violence exposure in their histories. And they just said no. They never really gave me a good answer. But that was very frustrating for me as a graduate student to think, wow, I did all this work to do this research. I think we found some really interesting things, and it's never going to get out into the public sphere. And so again, that was another lesson about, this agency. It was their proprietary data, and they had the right to do with it what they wanted. And so that was another growing pain for me, learning about, okay, so policy relevant research is a little bit different than academia. So I finished my degree. I ended up doing a postdoc in prevention and intervention science at Arizona State. They have a great training program there. And I highly recommend training in intervention, and we're going to talk about that some more later, because for policy relevant research, evaluations are kind of the name of the game for doing policy relevant research. So getting that training was important. And then my husband got a job at Columbia University, so here comes the first serendipity. So I just knew I was moving to New York, and I told Elisa Houston that. She's like, well, you should look up Larry Aber at the National Center for Children in Poverty. And so I did, and I had lunch with him at SRCD. And for whatever reason, he decided to give me a part-time postdoc just after meeting me once, which was very kind of him. I always thank him for that opportunity. And so we moved to New York, and I started working at the National Center for Children in Poverty, kind of just trying to do research, writing grant proposals, because it was a soft money position. And so, writing grant proposals is a lot of what you have to do in those kind of positions. And then eventually I was hired on full-time as a research associate and worked there for 4 years as a research associate. And most of my job there was basically doing research that I would do in an academic setting, except that I had to fund my salary and all the salaries of my staff through grants. So there's a lot of pressure to write grants. I had no training in writing grants in graduate school at all. I'd read some grants, but I didn't have any training in how to do it. And so that's another thing to try to get experience in, is how to write grants, because you're going to need to know how to do that. And some things that I learned working at NCCP, which is it's a center that's based in the School of Public Health at Columbia University. So it's in an academic setting, but it's not really an academic institution, really. The center is not itself academic. It's just like an office that people go and work at. And so it's not a tenure track position. But one of the things I really learned there was the value of interdisciplinary work for thinking about policy. It really helps to think about important issues from various angles. And so working with sociologists and economists and folks who are trained in public policy research is really valuable, and really pushed me to think about, how does poverty affect children in very different ways, and considering things that I had never even thought about before. I also was doing some research on a long-term evaluation of a violence prevention program that Larry Aber had already been evaluating. And while we did that, unfortunate serendipity is 9/11 happened, and we kind of quickly did a research survey on 9/11, which I think also ended up being very policy relevant, kind of some of the things we learned about the effects of 9/11 on kids. And then the next kind of serendipitous turn was my husband got offered a job at the University of Michigan. And so I applied for a job at the University of Michigan in the School of Social Work. They had a job focused on poverty. And so I applied for that and got it, surprisingly. And so it turned out that social work, which I'd never really considered as a field for myself much before, turned out to be a very natural fit for someone who wants to do research that's related to interventions. I didn't have to apologize anymore for wanting to do research on interventions and applied research. And applied research, can sometimes be a dirty word in some psychology departments and places like that. But in social work, they're just like, of course, why wouldn't you do that? So that was really nice to be somewhere that was very accepting of research that's very applied. And so I was there for several years, but I still did do basic research there as well. Work with a bunch of folks in the psychology department at Michigan on basic research questions. And then took a job here at the University of Texas at Austin. My husband and I both kind of decided to do one more big move. And so we both got jobs back here at UT Austin, where we had gone to graduate school. And I'll talk more about research I'm doing now that I'm here.
Great. So now we know how serendipity got you both to where you are. So I'm curious at what level of the government you're involved with in your work right now, and also the different ways that you engage in policy and practice, and some like specific activities that you're involved with. So Liz, why don't you keep going, and then we'll go back to Rachel.
Okay, so I'll just kind of work down through the government, or maybe, well, I guess I'll do my part first, and then we'll show those slides. That makes sense. So Rachel, what did you say?
I didn't say anything, but either way, it's fine. That's good.
Okay, I'll just go ahead and do my part, and then you can do the slides in your part. So at the federal level, I basically, I get grants from the federal government to do research, mostly from NICHD, but also I've gotten them from NIMH and CDC. But a lot of what I'm doing is just analyzing data that comes from the federal government, and so I'm sure everyone on the call knows about big secondary data sets that are out there that you can analyze that are very easy to get, like the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study and things like that. But there's other data sets that you can ask for that are either restricted use or just not publicly known, but you can ask for them and get them. And so I have a grant right now from NICHD to study the effects of Head Start on children using the Head Start Impact Study, which is a study that the government conducted, and you can apply and get that data. But I'm also interested in looking at school discipline practices. So I've started looking at school contexts as well. And I just wrote to the Department of Education for data on all the schools across the country, and they just sent it to me on a disk. No contract, nothing. They just send you the disk. It's data on every single school across the country. So that's kind of amazing that you can just ask for data like that. Also, FBI, I have data from the FBI to look at crime data. They also will just send you these files that have all kinds of data at very small, like you can get to the census tract level, just for asking. So there's lots of data out there that are very policy relevant. Looking at contexts that kids are living in, going to school in, getting these big national data sets are really important. At the state level, I have an agreement with the state of Texas to give me data from their Department of Family and Protective Services, which is where they cover child abuse and foster care. And we're going to be getting 5 years of data from them to look at the effects of foster care and kind of what happens to kids once they're in care over time. And we've been trying to get this data for a year, and so getting data like this is not always easy. The Texas data, they keep pushing back the deadlines, and so you have to be very patient, but it's worth it to get that data. The trick is then you have to work out with the agency giving you the data if they are going to have veto power over papers you're going to write, or whether they just are going to kind of make sure they're accurate before you send them out. Because it's a real privilege to get to work with data like that. And the agencies want to make sure that things are not going to put them in a bad light, but then we also have an obligation, I feel, to the children who are in those data sets to make sure that their experiences are going to make other kids' lives better. And so that can be sometimes tricky, working out who's going to have oversight and things like that. And then at the local level, I'm working with our local United Way had a program that they wanted evaluated, and so I worked with them to collect some data for that. And then I'm also part of a partnership on 2-generation programs here in Austin that has members from the city of Austin and the county of our Travis County. And they have data that they bring to bear that's part of this kind of consortium trying to get more 2-generation programs in Austin. And I got to each of these data sets in various ways, but those are kind of the various levels that I'm working at right now.
Great. Well, this is Rachel again, and I'm going to take the prerogative since nobody can yell at me, so I'll just go ahead and do what I want to. But I want to go back and address something that Liz said in answer to the first question that I think was really important to highlight, which is that this work is really interdisciplinary, and even within academic settings, we can fit in many different departments. And I think Liz was very flexible in terms of finding a place that was right for her work and not necessarily within the same discipline she had trained in. And I've had the same experience. I trained in psychology, as I told you. My first academic job was in an applied developmental program at George Mason University, and now I'm in the School of Education for the first time, and it makes sense for the work that I do. And I think that having that kind of flexible mindset in terms of terminology and kind of where you place yourself can be really helpful. Okay, now I'm going to turn to the question that I'm supposed to be answering, which is level of government. And Tracy put together some amazing slides for us, and I thought maybe we could look through them together. Just, again, this may be known to some of you, but she also just has amazing PowerPoint skills. So this just shows the kind of basic infrastructure of government. We know about the 3 branches. And then within the executive branch, we have all of these different departments. And, you know, the work that we are interested can be funded and of interest to many of these departments. But we're going to focus in on Health and Human Services just a little bit. Thank you, Hannah. And within, again, Health and Human Services, I think the major point to make here is that there are many places to look for funding for policy-relevant work. You know, SAMHSA, HRSA, CDC, NIH, of course, all fund research that is relevant. And again, the research that they fund is all very different from one another. So getting familiar with their websites, the kinds of things that they fund is very important. And within NIH, there are many, many different branches that fund the kind of work that we do. There's NIMH, there's NIDA, there's NICHD. There are a lot of places to look. But we are going to highlight, right now, Hannah's highlighting for us, the Administration for Children and Families, which is really, that's where I worked when I was in government. That's where Nina works. That's where a lot of the services part of Health and Human Services is located. This is a little bit hard to see, but it includes things, like I said, like Head Start and child care and the Children's Bureau. And then there's this research office that cuts across all of these different programs, and it's called OPRE, the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. So I think that's just to give you some kind of placement in terms of where we're talking about when we talk about this work. So most of my work is really program evaluation at the federal and local level. I've done very little work to date at the state level, in part because I've moved quite a bit, and again, this work is relationship-based. And you know, now that I'm in a place, and I know I'm going to be here for a long time, I'm hoping that that will be a new direction for my work. And interestingly, most of my projects are contracts, and Liz has already talked a little bit about the difference between a contract and a grant. And when I was in government, I was doing evaluation work, and I was overseeing mostly contracts. I was the coordinator of infant toddler research in the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, so I oversaw basically most research related to infants and toddlers, but primarily that was related to early Head Start. And we addressed questions like, you know, what did the program look like? This is a large national program, so we had descriptive questions to answer. What did the programs look like? What did the staff? Who were the staff? Who were the children and families being served? We also answered impact questions. We had an impact study. And then we also funded, and those things were done under contract, right, where we knew we had a question we needed to answer. We hired a research firm, and that was how we went about answering those questions. But then we had innovation projects, and those were most often done through grants. And OPRE does a lot of work, which is it's a really lovely way of funding innovation work, because they fund grantees who then have to have some amount of collaboration with one another. They fund consortia who come together and meet and do some cross-site work. And again, those can really bring value to the government beyond any one specific project. You can learn a lot more across different projects, but I think for the researchers too, it's really exciting to sit around for several years to get to know people who are working on similar projects to yourself. So again, when you think about applying for grants, going for grants, think about what is the experience like being a grantee for different agencies. They're very, very different. So, and again, most of my current work that I'm doing is contracts. And, you know, again, as Liz said, funders know what they want, and the funders own the data. But I have really found, unlike Liz, I've never been held back from publishing on a contract. I think that if you have the relationships with people, if you're working with the funder in a collaborative way throughout the process, it is possible to bring them in on the dissemination piece, explain why you think this is important for the information to get out, and I think it is possible to do that. But it's different than working on a grant, that is for sure. One point I want to make, and maybe Hannah, if you could go down 2 slides here. Most of my work tends to be on programs that have what I would call centralized governance. That means that the funder directly works with the program and establishes the expectations for the program. For example, in this slide you can see under ACF, I guess I should explain what all these acronyms are, right? There's ACF, the Administration for Children and Families. OHS, on the next line down all the way to the left, is the Office of Head Start. So Head Start is funded federal to local. So and this is program funding. This is not research funding. This is program funding in this slide. So Head Start programs are all held to the same performance standards that are monitored over time. So the expectations are the same for all programs. Whereas OCC, the next column over, which is the Office of Child Care, those are block grants that go to the state and then are distributed. And then there's the Children's Bureau, CB, which again goes through the state. So, and other programs, you know, like pre-K is out of the Department of Education, but it is also a block grant. And I think when you have a program that is more, the governance is more centralized, it changes some of your evaluation questions. So for instance, another evaluation I'm involved in is an evaluation of early steps to school success, which is a home visiting program in rural communities throughout the country, which is funded by Save the Children. And so again, we want to answer questions for the funder about what are the programs looking like across the country, what are the impacts of the program across the country. Whereas if you're interested in a block grant, you may be interested in impacts across the entire program, but you may also be interested in how is each state's policy context influencing the way these programs are looking. So it's another layer added to your research questions, I think. And as an aside, I'll just say that I think early childhood is really in flux right now because the government is working to tear down the silos between these different programs in early childhood, the child care, Head Start, pre-K, and I'm sure this will affect our research agendas in ways that we probably can't even predict right now. So it's an exciting time for early childhood research and policy research. I'm going to stop there, Nina.
That was great. Thank you both so much. So I just wanted to highlight a few very concrete activities that kind of came up in each of your answers. So you both highlighted applying for grants and for contracts from various government agencies. Liz specifically you both highlighted using and accessing administrative data to be able to collaborate with various levels of government and answering questions. You both talked about partnering with states, local governments, or even programs to answer research questions on both ends, the researcher end and the program end. And then, Rachel, you talked a little bit about topical or professional networks that you talked about them specifically through the ones that are organized through OPRE, but there are others I'm sure that exist as well. And then there were 2 other things that I was wondering about. One is, Rachel, if you wanted to say something, a word or 2, just a couple sentences about being invited to participate in technical expert panels that are associated with big government projects. And also, Liz, if you wanted to talk about being invited to testify to Congress.
Sure. I think all of the large program evaluation studies do invite kind of academic experts to weigh in and offer advice. And I think, you know, you have to be seen as an expert in a field in order to do that. So I think, again, the kind of expertise that Liz has talked about, becoming an expert in both methodology, statistical methodology, evaluation methodology, measurement is huge, and in working with certain populations can be very helpful to some of the large national surveys. And then I think, again, I'll come back to this idea that it's all about relationships. So seek out some of the people who work in government, who are working on some questions and programs you're interested in. Go up to them at meetings. Try to go to meetings that they are at, things like the National Research Conference on Early Childhood, which was formerly the Head Start Research Conference. That's a great place to meet people. APAM is a place to meet people, SRCD. Walk up and meet them. People in research firms, get to know them, because they are the people who often suggest the names to folks in government. And that's a great way to get involved.
So I can talk a little bit about the talking to Congress. Actually, I haven't been able to do a testimony to Congress yet. I was invited once, but wasn't able to go. What I have done is a briefing. And so a briefing is you go on Capitol Hill and kind of do an educational presentation, very brief, about the issues. And so I, in November, was on the Hill to talk about a bill to ban corporal punishment in schools because it's still legal in 19 states. And Representative Elsie Hastings from Florida has introduced a bill to ban it. And so this was a briefing kind of to try to educate some staffers on the Hill about the issues. And so that was kind of my job, was to tell them, here's the issues, here's what you need to know, this is why this, you know, as a researcher, these are the problems with corporal punishment, and why this bill might be a really good idea. And so I got invited to do that mostly because I'm an expert in this area and have been doing this for years. And to become that expert, you know, obviously I published in our traditional academic journals, but I also got hooked up with the advocacy community pretty early on. I was invited to some advocacy meetings of folks who are working against corporal punishment in all forms pretty early on. There's some advocates that have been doing this work for years. And so I got to know these folks over the years, and over time they invited me to do various things and be a part of various projects, one of which was to write a lay summary of research on physical punishment. So I'd done it for academic journals. This one was a kind of a lay summary that anybody could read, and it was put up on the Phoenix Children's Hospital website, so it was kind of in partnership with them. They had an effective discipline initiative. And so, and that I, you know, got to do because I know the research, but I had to write it in a way that was a much simpler way for other people to understand. And that has been used by people all over the world to kind of educate other folks about physical punishment. I know for sure in Memphis a couple years ago they were trying to decide whether to ban corporal punishment from schools, and they read that report that I wrote and decided to ban it. So that was pretty exciting. But when I decided to write that report at the time, I was at Michigan, and one of my mentors, Arnold Samaroff, had kind of said to me, I asked him, I was like, do you think I should do this or not? And he had said, well, you know, it's a valuable thing, but you also, you know, your value is in being the academic expert. And, you know, that you should be the one who has the unassailable evidence that other people can use. And I trusted his advice, and I thought about it for a long time, and then I realized that if I didn't do it, no one else would, and that I was really the best person to do it. So I ended up going against Arnold Samaroff's advice, although I would trust him on many other things. But I decided to go ahead and do that anyway because I felt that it was important to be involved in that. And my involvement with these advocates has actually led to research. So one of the advocates I know hooked me up with 2 hospitals that were instituting something called no-hit zones, basically a hospital-wide policy to end hitting in the hospital, because it turns out there is a fair amount of hitting in the hospital. People are very stressed in that environment. And so I'm doing the evaluation of this no-hit zone for 2 different hospitals in the Midwest that I just got hooked up through this advocate. So you never know kind of how the research and policy kind of feed back into each other.
That's great. Thank you both. So my next question is about the types of research questions that drive your work and how you select them. And this question really comes from a place where I think most of us understand that when you're in an academic setting, you have a lot of control over your research agenda, as opposed to maybe a contracting firm or a research firm who's responding to RFPs or questions that are being put out by the government. So I'm curious how you do select your questions and what kind of situations there might be some sort of limitation or some sort of like firmer direction coming from the outside, or being placed on the questions that you're setting. And I'm sort of hinting at the difference between grants and contracts here a little bit, but I think that there are other things to discuss as well. So let's go back to Rachel and then we'll go to Liz.
I like that question and your new additions to it too. So my work really focuses on infants and toddlers, on the development and refinement of intervention programs for families with very, very young children. I'm interested in both home visiting and child care, and I'm very heavily focused on the role of programs in supporting parents and positive parenting behaviors. So I told you a little bit about my work in the government. I continue to do analyses of early Head Start data. I really do believe in the secondary data analysis that Liz talked about. I think especially for graduate students, you can never collect the kind of data to answer the kinds of questions as a graduate student, right? Even as a faculty member, I can't do that. But there are some of these wonderful, expensive government data sets that the government wants you to use, and they often have programs to train you to use them. There's the Early Head Start Impact Study. It's the Early Head Start Research and Evaluation Project that I continue to do a lot of analyses on. That is at the Murray Center at Harvard and MIT. And, use it. It is available to the public. There's the National Survey of Child and Adolescent Well-Being for people who are interested in child maltreatment data. There's the Early Childhood Longitudinal Survey Birth Cohort and Kindergarten Cohort. There's the new National Survey of Early Care and Education. There are just so many incredible data sets, and they let you really practice sophisticated statistical methodologies. They also just expose you to kinds of data that's it's a wonderful experience, and again can bring you to the attention of some folks who collect those kinds of data and are interested in those kinds of questions, for them to see you as an expert. So anyway, part of my work is still analyzing data that's existing. I still am working on the Early Head Start study. We have new data that is still coming online. A group of us are looking at the long-term effects of Early Head Start on child maltreatment. So we've gone back to the communities that were involved in that study way back when, in the late 1990s, and we're collecting administrative data in 16 of those communities, looking at the records of the kids in our study. And administrative data is also an extremely valuable tool for policy researchers. It's not easy to use. You need to have a lot of support in using that data, in both kind of getting it from the government sources, then figuring out how to make sure that it's coded correctly to address your questions, and also especially if you're doing cross-site work, it is incredibly complicated. Beth Green at Portland State is the one responsible for doing that in our study. She is amazing. But it's extremely powerful. It's not easy to use, but it's very powerful. Another strand of my work that I want to mention does not involve research per se, but it's really in helping to coordinate groups of researchers and linking researchers and policy makers to those who are responsible for running programs. So for instance, I coordinate the Network of Infant Toddler Researchers, which is a group funded by the Office of Planning, Research and Evaluation to facilitate networking among researchers, and also to bridge policy practice and research worlds by encouraging researchers to be more responsive to questions of policymakers and to help infuse research into policy and practice. And that's one of my favorite parts of my work. If I haven't made it clear already, I believe this work is completely collaborative. All of my work is collaborative. And you know, I think we're not taught how to do collaborative work when we're in graduate school, and it's a skill. So that's something to start practicing as early as possible, and it can be collecting data with one of your peers, or working on secondary data analysis on papers with peers. It's just good experience. I really do believe that collaborative research is the best way to do research. It's that brings different perspectives and knowledge and disciplines to the table and abilities, and it also allows for cross-site work often for larger studies that can look at site variation. And honestly, it's just more rewarding and fun. You know, these people that you have long-term relationships with, it becomes extremely rewarding in and of itself. And in fact, I would say that, you know, if you ask me, I have my interests, but a lot of the particular papers I decide to write or projects I decide to bid on, it has to do with the teams that come together and who I want to work with. So that really is important to me. Now, for those of you in graduate school, you might say, well, Rachel, how do I get involved in groups? And I think that there are a lot of ways to access groups. I think you're all ahead of the curve because you're already involved in this consortium. But also, I described some consortia that the government create. So I think thinking again about where you apply for your grants. The Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation has fabulous dissertation grants, both child care and Head Start dissertation grants. And if you get one of those, not only do you have a little consortium of the grantees, but then you're also invited to join the Child Care Policy and Research Consortium, which is a wonderful group. It's not open to the public, but it's a wonderful group. Other groups like the Network of Infant Toddler Researchers I just described are open to the public. There are often opportunities. I just saw recently that the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation is going to support, it's not really funding, but it's going to support a learning community of people who are using the data from the National Survey of Early Care and Education to kind of say, why don't you guys talk to each other and share what you're learning, which is a wonderful way to also get involved, is talking to people using similar data sets. And then finally, I'll just end on this note, you can also create your own groups. So, for instance, you can meet people at conferences, as I suggested. I already mentioned a couple conferences to come to. I really encourage you to come to the National Research Conference of Early Childhood. That will be this summer in DC. There's no registration fee, so that can sometimes help for graduate students. Introduce yourself to people at conferences, or if there are people whose work you've been reading and you have a paper to present, maybe invite people doing that work, similar work to yours, to submit a symposium with you. And finally, some groups can really be grassroots, and I'm going to tell you about one group I'm involved in, which is it's a wonderful name. It's the Collaborative for the Understanding of the Pedagogy of Infant-Toddler Development, and we named it that so we could get a good acronym, which is CUPID, and it is open to everybody. And it started with a group of 5 people who knew each other previously from working on early Head Start research, and we were sitting over dinner one night and talking about our teaching. We were all teaching infant-toddler development courses, and one person at the table, Claire Valaton, was talking about how she was evaluating her teaching. And we all got really excited about it, and we started talking to our friends, who started talking to other people, and 2 years later, we had 50 people in 25 institutions of higher education, and we were all coming together to collect information on our classes and common pre- and post-survey questionnaires on our students. We had our students fill out. So this was really completely self-generated through just talking about our work with people that we know. So, you know, I do think that that can be the beginning of some really big projects. So I will stop there.
Well, I'll just say something quickly so we can have time for our advice at the end. Just to say that I think that policy relevant research is on a continuum, and so any research can be policy relevant, and so even basic research can have some really policy relevant issues. And so in my work on spanking, there's some part of the debate about spanking. When policymakers will talk about it, they'll say, oh, well, the researchers are debating about these various things, so we can't decide yet. So in order for the policy to get decided, we, the researchers, have to decide what we know. And so I spend a lot of time actually answering basic questions, basic science questions that will then down the line feed into policy. So as you're doing your own work, don't despair that you're not evaluating a policy or program right now. There's a very big range in what you can do that's going to inform policy. So I think I'm just going to say that so we have time to go on to our advice. Quickly, one quick thing that I was supposed to touch on a little bit more, just to make it explicit, was the difference between grants and contracts. Grants, you apply to the government, you get money, and you have complete control over the research questions. Whereas a contract, the granting agency usually has some questions they want answered, and your job is to answer those questions. And so you're contracted to do that. So you have a little less control over what you're doing than when you have a grant, when you have very much free reign. And so if you go to work at more of a think tank kind of place or a policy evaluation shop, you'll do more contract stuff. And if you go into academia, you'll probably do more grant stuff, but as Rachel's shown, you can kind of do a mix of both.
Perfect. All right, and we have 5 minutes left, and as our speakers alluded, we wanted to have them each give their advice for graduate students or early career professionals who want to embark on a research policy career. So Liz, why don't you start again, and then we will go to Rachel next.
Sure. Well, I'll just reiterate the first point that we made earlier on, that getting experience in evaluation and studying interventions and kind of what those mean and how to study them is really important, because a lot of the policy work involves evaluating programs that the government pays for. And so trying to find, if you're still in graduate school, courses that you can take in how to do that. If you're not in graduate school, just reading a lot, talking to people who do that research, finding out kind of what the key questions they like to answer are, and kind of the research methods they use is really important to do. Those are skills that will really carry you a long way. Rachel, you want to do the next one?
Sure. I would just add to that. I think that I agree with Liz completely about kind of getting as much experience in methods and statistics. I also want to bring up mixed methods. I think it's very important in our good policy work to have both the qualitative and the quantitative together, and getting some skills. I will say I had to learn the qualitative as I've gone along, and I wish I had known more when I got started.
Definitely true. Sure. So, I mean, we said this earlier, learning how to use secondary data sets and administrative data. There are arts to both of those things. Your mentor may or may not know how to use those. So trying to find somebody who can mentor you and how to use those, it's really important to do, because there's a lot of data out there if you just know where to look and how to use it.
And I just want to reiterate, I think, what I said pretty strongly before, which is getting involved in groups, meeting people, sometimes stepping outside of your comfort zone and meeting people outside of your program in your area. And I think I gave some examples before, so I'll just leave it there.
Another piece of advice is if you're interested in policy, to do some kind of internship if you're still in graduate school, either paid or unpaid, just to get experience of working somewhere out in the real world that's not academia, either in a advocacy agency or someplace that does evaluation work, or in the government, just to kind of see how research is used in other places, to see if that's the kind of job you want or if you want to go into academia. I think if you're on the fence, it's really important to get some volunteer experience under your belt so you can make an informed decision about whether you want to do academia or a more applied research setting.
Another skill that I think is really important to get in graduate school is learning how to translate research for various audiences, and I think Liz touched on that a lot in her comments. Taking any kind of training you can get about how to engage with media, how to, give your elevator speech about your work, and also just practice distilling research on a particular topic and translating what does that mean. for programs, really trying to get good at summarizing in clear language and then thinking about what some of the implications are. And again, it's probably helpful to do that in a group rather than doing that on your own, because it's just helpful to bounce ideas off of people when doing that kind of work. It is not easy to do. It sounds easy, but it's really not easy. Liz, did you have any other ones?
No, I mean, I think other than just trying to attend some policy relevant conferences like APAM or AERA or anywhere that policy relevant research is being presented, a really great way, again, to meet people and just to see what kinds of work are going on out there, and the kinds of work the government's interested in. It's interesting to see that too.
All right, thank you both so much for sharing all of your experiences with us, and also for sharing so much really valuable advice. I know it's, personally I can take it and use it right away, and I hope that others on the phone feel the same way. So I think we are completely out of time. I'm going to pass it off to Hannah, but thank you all so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to thank everyone, our moderator, Nina Philipsen Hetzner, and Tracy Carter Clopêt, who assisted but was not able to be on today, and then our speakers, Elizabeth and Rachel, as well as all of our attendees for joining us today. If you enjoyed today's call, you may be interested in future consortium webinars, which will be hosted throughout this and future academic years. You can also join the consortium listserv to receive notifications about future webinars, our quarterly newsletter, as well as job postings and resource and event announcements. And then I will be sending out a follow-up email to all of the webinar registrants as well as the consortium listserv, and I will attach a copy of today's slides, the speaker bios, and also include a link to today's call, which was recorded, and I will be posting it to SRCD's YouTube channel. So thank you all again for joining, and I hope you have a lovely day.